Alright, in chapter 7 we are going to be graphing the trig functions without a calculator. So today in 7.1 we're going to graph sine and cosine without a phase shift. That will make more sense in 7.2 when I show you how to do that. So two of the things I want to show you right now is that these are your basic functions and graphs for sine and cosine. Now, usually when we graph it, I'm only going to have you graph one period. But as you can see, this will keep continuing on forever. So when we graph, we're just going to graph one period. So for sine, it will start at what we call the midline. And for cosine, it starts at the top. Now, one of the things I want you to notice right now is that there are actually 4 points after the starting point that I want you to graph that are exact. So for sine, our starting point is at 0, 0 in this case, and then it goes top, midline, bottom, midline. Cosine starts at the top, midline, bottom, midline, top. Okay, so I'm going to be looking for those coordinates every time. So what parts of our function show on our graph? Well, our amplitude, A, is half the distance from the maximum. In other words, I think of this as our height. This height can be found in the function of being the coefficient in front of the trig function. Okay, so in cosine it's in front of it, and sine it's in front of it. Next is our period. So that is the length of one full rotation there. The period is found by going 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. So b is our coefficient in front of x. The midline cuts our graph in half, and that is shown by k, which is added on to the very end. In example 1, I want you to fill out that midline, amplitude, and we're going to describe where the graph starts, but we're going to wait till graphing till after. Okay, so as you can see, this is a sine graph, which means you're going to start at the midline. The midline, of course, is what's added at the very end, so it's at -1. So the midline is going to be at x equals -1 because it's a horizontal line. The amplitude, remember the height from the midline, is that coefficient in front of the trig function. So in this case it's 2. And our full rotation is 2 pi over the absolute value of b, which in this case is 3 pi. Let's make sure that we are simplifying this. So our full rotation is 2/3. First thing I'm going to do with graphing is identify my x and y axis. So I'm going to use different colors to help identify things. So my x and y. And sometimes you want to figure out if you really want it in the middle or not, because your midline and your amplitude will shift everything. Luckily for us, this isn't too much of a shift, so I will put it right in the middle. That is my x and y axis. Next, I'm going to graph the midline. The midline is at -1. I'm using different colors so I can identify which one's which. Now my amplitude is 2. So from my midline, I'm going to go up 2. And that's the top. And I'm going to go down 2, and that's the bottom. So earlier when I said a full period has those 4 points after the starting point, those will only go on our top, our midline, or our bottom. This is also why I like using different colors. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this graph up. So this will change every time that you graph. I know I'm going to have 4 points after my midline. So, or not my midline, my starting point. So I'm going to divide this graph up by 2 units. So as you can see, I'm going to have a point somewhere here, 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 and here. What I do know is that that last one has to be at 2/3. Okay? Now, you are going to have to identify the other parts. So that means we are going to take 2/3 and divide it by 4, because there's 4 sections. If you remember, dividing is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 4 is 1/4. When we calculate this out and reduce it, I am left with 1/6. This means that each one of these goes by 1/6. So I'm going to label that now. So the first one is 1/6. The second one would be 2/6, which is 1/3. The third one would be 3/6, which is 1/2. 4/6 is 2/3, so we're good there. Now, let's remember what we identified. When we're doing sine, we start at the midline. So this is my y-axis. I'm going to start at the midline. And because it's positive, after the midline we go up. So, after the midline, I will be at the upper line. Okay, and I have to be at that 1/6. My next one will go back down to the midline at that 1/3. And I go all the way down to the lower line at 1/2. And then we end up at the midline at 2/3. And I connect. There is our sine function. Let's try another one. I'm going to try a cosine. And one thing I want you to recognize right here is that yes, it is cosine, but there is a negative out front. What does a negative tell us to do? Hopefully you told us that a negative flips the function. Since cosine originally has us start at the top and there is a negative out front, that means we start at the bottom. Alright, let's fill out the rest of our stuff. The midline will be at x equals 3. And the amplitude, that height from the midline, is 5. The period, 2 pi over b. Our b in this case is 1/2. Just like we talked about division in the other problem, dividing by something is multiplying by the reciprocal. Gives us 4 pi. Let's graph our x and y axis. Now, our x-axis, though, we have to be careful because I need the midline to be at 3, and then we're going 5 from there. So that's 8 altogether. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And let's leave 1 for some room. Okay, that should work. Now let's graph our midline, which is at 3. And we're going 5 from there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember that 5 is not from the x-axis, it's from the midline. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this, of course, is stretching our graph a little bit more vertically. So again, I'm going to have my 4 points after my starting. And I know I'm ending it in 4 pi. Because that was my period. I need to figure out each piece. So I take my period and I divide it by 4. Which means each section is 1 pi. So I go 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and what do you know? We end up at 4 pi. Alright, let's go back here. Cosine, we would start at the top, but since it's negative cosine, we're starting at the bottom. So our y-axis, we start at the bottom. We can't go below the lower line, so we have to continue going up. And remember, each point is on my purple marks. So the midline upper, midline lower. So at pi, our next one up would be at the midline. 2 pi would be at the upper. 3 pi would be back down to the midline. And 4 pi would be down below. And when we connect these, you realize this is cosine, and it's flipped. Yes, the hardest part to graphing is dividing up your period into 4 sections, but we'll work on that. In example 3, we're going to go backwards. Okay, so we are going to write the equation. Before I can see if it's sine or cosine, I might want to start with the midline. If you remember, the midline is halfway between the top and the bottom. So if we look, halfway between these two marks is at 2. Now you can see that we start at the midline. Which one of these functions starts at the midline? Sine. The other thing I want you to notice is that once we start at the midline, what direction does our graph go? It goes down. But our original function for sine went up. So what does that mean? It means that sine is negative because we're flipping it. So again, we started at the midline. So it's sine, but we usually go up for sine. Since we go down, in this case, it's going to be a negative sign. Amplitude is the height from the midline to the top. So 1, 2, 3. Now our period. You remember, our period is 4 points from the start. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that is a full rotation. It starts at the midline, ends at the midline. So in this case, our period is 2 pi. But from there, we have to get our b. So remember, the period comes from 2 pi over b. And in this case, it equals 2 pi, because that's our period. So 2 pi divided by what is 2 pi? Well, hopefully you said 1, so b equals 1. We have all the info we need. Now we are going to make our function. So I'm going to do it at the bottom. So we have f of x. Well, we know it's negative since it flipped. Our amplitude comes next, so that is our 3. Our function is sine. Our b is 1. I'm going to write the 1 in here just so you can see it, but you do not have to write the 1 in the long run. And then we're adding our midpoint at the end. And we just created a function from a trig graph. Let's do it one more time, and then I'll have you guys practice on your own. We started by finding the midline. This one's a little bit easier to see. So our midline is at -4. As you can see, we're starting at the top. So what trig function are we using? Top means we're using cosine. The amplitude, so our height from the midpoint to our top, is 1. And let's check out our period. Remember, it's 4 points. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That means that our period is pi. So let's solve for b. 2 pi over b equals pi. I'm going to solve this out, though some of you might be able to recognize it. I don't like b in the denominator, so I'm going to multiply both sides by b. Then I'm going to get b by itself, so I divide by pi, giving me 2 equals our b. We are able now to write our function, so f of x equals, there's no negative because we didn't flip it, we started on top, so that's good. Our amplitude is 1. I'm going to write the 1 in right now just so you can see where I'm putting it, but do you have to put it there in the long run? No, you do not. Our trig function is cosine. Our b is 2. Don't forget that x. That x will always have to be in there, guys. And then at the very end, we have our midline, which in this case is -4. And you guys now are all set to go get your homework and try that practice.